Right. Hey guys, how are we doing? Back another video from Annie News, continuing with his cut content videos for MUSHOKU TENSEI Season 2. This last episode, it wasn't what I was expecting. The last turning point was really like, oh my god, decision, like, flipping. As soon as I said this was turning point 3, I was just like, oh wow. But when we got in there, it was like, yeah, some decisions have been made here, some interesting ones. The man god telling Rudy to do one thing and then Rudy deciding to do another. I was kind of like, oh. I think going forward is where the downfall is going to be. But I'm intrigued to see what was left out because this was interesting. Like it was the sister that really pushed him to go out and find his mum finally and help Paul and that, wasn't it? Because she was going to go. And he was like, you know, and she was like, you're powerful enough to go and do something about it. And he's like, oh, fine. I'm sorry. You're right. Stay here. But Sylvie's pregnant and all this other stuff. And I just feel like this is the wrong decision. But what else happened? What was added, potentially? Let's find out.
Turning Point 3 wasn't quite the same tone as Turning Points 1 or 2, but
No.
it was a significant change to the story just like the others before it. The anime did a fantastic job capturing the emotion of it all, but there was a bit more to Rudy's indecisiveness.
Right.
More thoughts regarding whether he should go to Begarit or not, and more emotional turmoil as he came to the final decision for it. This was preceded by another day in the life type chapter, and it's here we get a good old-fashioned calm before the storm scenario. So, as we go through that and the missing details from Turning Point 3, hopefully you'll appreciate more yet another amazing episode of Mushoku Tensei.
Cool.
Episode 42, Turning Point 3, covering chapters 6 and 7 from volume 11 of the light novel.
Only 2 chapters.
With a
alright.
month having passed since Norn's incident, this would mark the second summer since Rudy arrived here. A change in season that often came with a change of outfits since the warmer weather usually let people dress a bit more lightly. Unfortunately, the anime kept everyone dressed the same, but you can
Oh.
find those different outfits in the manga.
Alright, okay, that kind of makes sense. I think it's just easier for animators, isn't it, if they've still got the same character design, same clothing. It's not often characters do change clothes within shows, is it?
The weather wasn't the only thing that had changed though, since a certain someone hadn't shown their face in quite a while. Whereas they'd occasionally stop by for dinner or watch Rudy train, ever since that stare down with Ruijerd, Bodygotti hadn't shown up since. It was likely he wandered off and forgot to tell anyone. It's something the anime doesn't really mention, but in the novel it's a recurring detail since Rudy has been actively looking for Bodygotti.
Oh, okay.
Now, Rudy and Norn studying in the library was actually something that Norn had asked for. She personally made the request to be tutored by him. Of course, Rudy was ready to teach her everything, but out of worry that he may make Aisha feel left out, he decided to limit Norn's lessons to 1 hour daily,
Right.
making it a condensed study
Clever.
session in which the two could review everything her classes covered that day. It was clear Norn was trying her best, but Rudy could tell understanding everything was difficult for her. Not nearly as much as it was for Eris or Ghislaine, but it would definitely take quite a bit of effort to get her up to speed with everything. So, it was while at one of these study sessions that Norn would change the topic to Ruijerd. It wasn't rare for them to have casual conversations like this, but most of the time Norn just wanted to talk about him. This would
He is a
include where he was
dude.
from and what the demon continent was like, then just like in the anime, the story of his spear.
Yeah, that's like, I mentioned it last one, didn't I? But I confuse myself sometimes because I mentioned little bits from this episode in the last one. That I like that they started joining in on the conversation that like Rudy wanted to make write Ruijerd's story, and then she was like, "Yeah, I got stories I could tell as well."
They were all things that reminded Rudy of his plan to help Ruijerd. The reason why he couldn't before was because a lot of his spare time was occupied heavily by advanced healing and intermediate detoxification classes. Remember, the spells here were akin to trying to memorize an entire book. Something Rudy knew he was getting better at, but only due to the copious amounts of time that he put into it. He did consider spending that time upping his fire and wind magic to the saint level, but spells of that caliber typically required dramatic manipulations of the climate. They weren't really as practical as advanced healing or intermediate detoxification. Certainly not spells you were going to use on a day-to-day basis. That being the case, Rudy figured it was best to focus on something a bit more useful. This included Ruijerd's story, and the main hiccup with that was how to approach it. Like, he couldn't just do a basic good versus evil type story, since with the evil person being Laplace, those in the demon continent probably wouldn't like the story very much. I mean, he was to many considered a legendary hero there. This made approaching the story difficult and opened up the opportunity for Norn to step in. As it turns out, despite her writing being a little bit childish, the recount of Ruijerd's tales through her provided the punch Rudy was missing in his. Sure, it was a little bit rough, but the way it read made Rudy remember Ruijerd vividly, so much so that he would often tear up in the moments after. This meant all Rudy had to do was be Norn's editor, and the book would turn out much better than if he was to do it. Now, fast forward to after the shopping trip with Aisha, and the scene with Nanahoshi brings us to something interesting. Not just the 6-phase plan she'd laid out for Rudy, but the core division that separates summoning magic into fiend summoning and spirit summoning. These were the two fields in which summoning magic was generally divided into, and they both summoned completely different entities. Fiends were intelligent creatures that you had to make a deal with, whereas spirits were artificial entities created out of mana. So, if we were to focus on fiends first, these were most of the time monsters you'd find out in the wild. Garden variety creatures you'd have to pay some form of compensation to, after which they'd start to work for you. This wasn't just limited to those types of monsters though, since fiend summoning also allowed you to summon legendary beasts from other worlds. Wow. It could even summon inanimate objects too, which by definition made Nanahoshi's summoning a type of fiend summoning. Naturally, this made Rudy think he could use it to summon Roxy's panties, which probably wasn't the worst application he could come up with for it. But anyway, spirit summoning on the other hand was more like artificial intelligence. A brand new entity was created out of mana, and the extent to which they could operate needed to be coded into them, much like how software needed programming. This was implemented during the design for the spell itself, so the more complex the spell, the more capable the spirit being summoned. It actually goes to highlight the fundamental difference between spirits and fiends, since while fiends are harder to control and can act on their own, spirits are easy to control but only act on the patterns programmed into them. Of course, the more complex the code, the more complex the spirit, and there was no limit to how far one could take that. Like, the authority on summoning Nanahoshi mentioned in this episode actually had a spirit so complex it could pass for a human. That was just how in-depth this spirit summoning could be taken. There was, however, one caveat in the way this magic was perceived, since many believed spirits were beings that lived in the barren world. To them, they were different life forms being forcibly summoned into this world. That would simply make it a variation of fiend summoning, but the discussion of such a topic was never fully investigated to determine if that was true or not. So, for now, fiend and spirit summoning were completely different. Now, a quick addition to the scroll Nanahoshi gave Rudy was that she had actually given him permission to duplicate and sell it. If he wanted to make a template then print a bunch of copies, Nanahoshi said he was more than welcome to.
Wow, okay.
Reason being that apparently the guy who made it had more pressing issues to worry about than the leak of a simple summoning scroll like this. So this was a nice asset to keep on hand if money got tight, and it would surely net him quite a bit if he did decide to sell it. Especially if he mentioned it was from Nanahoshi. This brings us now to Rudy's encounter with Zanaba, and the only thing to note from here was the interesting dynamic between him and Ginger. A couple chapters back, there was that whole incident where Zanaba was strangling her, but abuse like that didn't seem to bother her at all. In fact, despite their arrangement being that of a master and servant, to Rudy it seemed much more like a weird commuter marriage. That or the bond between a cult leader and their most faithful disciple.
Yeah.
Either way, what stuck out to Rudy was Ginger's approach to all this. She often kept herself out of view and only approached when needed, and despite there being a bodyguard room right next to Zanaba's, Ginger instead chose to sleep in an apartment down the street from him. She believed it was too presumptuous to reside next door to a prince like him.
Not best.
This is why Rudy asked the question that he did, and it made him think perhaps Ginger was some kind of masochist. Switching over to Cliff now, the contraption he built was more so described to be a sumo-sized loincloth. To further clarify the way it works, it essentially forces external mana in to counteract the internal mana within Alina Lise. The external mana is aligned with the frequency of the curses, and that in turn allows the two opposing flows to neutralize each other. Kind of like the way that noise cancelling works.
I'm intrigued to see if there's more to her decision of breaking up with him as well. Like, because she's never really wanted to just be with one person because of a curse and that, so I hope there's more to it.
A frequency gets cancelled out by the presence of one that's the direct opposite to it. Cliff's design was only just a prototype, but for some reason, Alina Lise insisted that it was good enough. To her, she didn't care how it looked, but to Cliff, he couldn't bear to have her even wear it. It was a point of conflict in which the two had actually gotten into a fight over.
Oh no.
That's what led to his plan to miniaturize it, and the rest was pretty much as we saw. One last thing to note from this scene here, though, is that the device did absolutely nothing to make Alina Lise less horny. So, even with the loincloth working the way it was supposed to, Alina Lise was still, well, Alina Lise.
Cool.
This brings us now to turning point 3, and the news of Rudy's child came a lot faster than he expected. Given how everyone was saying how elves had a hard time getting pregnant, he was surprised to hear that it had happened so fast. It was when he put his hand onto her stomach that the faintest bump could be felt coming from inside of it. It was a physical indication of what Rudy and Sylphie created together, and it was that realization that caused all sorts of emotions to arise in him. He knew what he was feeling was happiness, but to describe it only as such felt kind of inadequate. He couldn't put into words just how happy he was, but it was clear from his confusion that this emotion went far beyond that. Rudy would then get a bit frisky, even more so than what we saw, and Aisha would say a few sus things further indicating her interest in Rudy.
Right, no, brother dear, we need to be gentle with the lady of the house for a while. You're going to need to refrain from intercourse for the moment. Right, of course. Lifted the hand. Ah! No!
She would then proceed with her duties as the maid and go inform Princess Ariel of these new developments. This brings forth the cutscene in which Rudy and Sylphie are alone.
She did say one thing, didn't she? Was that was the last one? It was like, you need to show me, and can you show me as much love as you show Sylphie? And he was like, no, Paul would kick my ass. It's like,
and it's here where they have more of a heart-to-heart about everything. Once again, Rudy couldn't find the right words to say, but the message he wanted to express was that he'll be there to help her. Raising this child wasn't something he wanted Sylphie to think she'd have to do on her own, so the only thing he wanted to say was how he was going to take responsibility. Sylphie then asked whether he wanted a boy or a girl, and as it was now, that didn't really matter to him. So long as the kid was healthy and happy, Rudy felt he'd be satisfied no matter what. Sylphie would then express how she truly felt like Rudy's wife now, and it was then that Rudy realized just how anxious she probably was about everything. I mean, since she was always saying how difficult getting pregnant was for her, she was likely feeling inadequate at the thought of not being able to produce a kid for him. Now that such a burden was lifted, though, Sylphie could rest easy knowing that she could provide for Rudy.
Yeah, girl,
it did suck that he would have to put up with a dry spell, but in his own words, he said he'd live. In fact, if he ever went and slept with another woman, then Rudy told Sylphie she could kick him out of the house for good. Sylphie assured him that even if he did, she wouldn't be angry, but she
No, you can't say stuff like that to somebody, no!
did say how she'd be sad. She'd understand why he went and did it, but would still feel dejected knowing it happened. It was a relatively mild reaction given the topic they were talking about. Of course, Rudy had no plans to betray her at all, because if Sylphie went out and did the same thing to him, then he couldn't even imagine how awful it'd feel. Now, it was later that evening that Aisha would return, and along with her came the congratulations from everyone she'd talked to. Zenobus said he'd visit in 5 days, Ariel a bit later in 10, then along with her Cliff and Alina Lise. Linnea and Persenna said they'd visit whenever was convenient, and Nanahoshi simply said congrats. These were the messages from Rudy's closest friends here, minus Spotty Gotti since he was still missing. Now, normally Aisha would have taken this opportunity to flex on Norn, but instead she simply smirked with a look of pride. It wasn't exactly the non-competitive behavior Rudy was hoping for, but it was a good start considering things weren't quite as verbal anymore. That's not to say the two still didn't fight, but for now they weren't saying anything truly cruel to each other. It would just be a while before that lingering conflict between them was fully dissipated. Fast forward to 2 months after this, and that's when Rudy would receive word of Zenith's unsuccessful rescue. The letter was sent via express mail, but even that couldn't help it from taking 6 months to arrive here.
God damn, that's some time though. Having that 6 months, it's like, we need help. It's like, how desperate is it? Like, if it's been that much, how's the situation changed? Jesus
it was
Christ.
Immediately after that Rudy's world would flash white right before his eyes, and the next thing he knew, he was talking to the man god again.
Right.
So, to be transformed back into the person he hated so much instantly filled him with anger and resentment. It's the reason he was so hostile right from the get-go. The rest was pretty much word for word from the novels, then Rudy would find himself laying in bed. He couldn't remember how it was he had got there, so he could only assume that it was the shock that had gotten to him. Since the last thing he remembered was staring at the letter, that was the first thing that came to his head now. He recounted the alarming nature of such a message, then weighed it against that of what the man god had told him. This brought forth all the risks that came with traveling to Begarit, and the first was the possibility things were resolved by now. The second was the minimum year of travel it would take to get there and back, and the third was the possibility that he could die on this journey. They were all risks big enough to make him choose not to go right now. 3 days would pass without Rudy changing his mind, and the more he saw Aisha, Sylphie, and Norn, the more their looks of anxiety became apparent. This only made Rudy more uncertain in his decision, and it made him desperate for advice from the likes of Alina Lise and Zanaba. So, Alina Lise would mention how she would be abandoning her post with Ariel, mostly because there was actually very little real danger for her here. The whole thing was just a goodwill gesture on her part anyway, so her leaving wasn't something the princess could even object to. As for her breakup with Cliff, this was something Rudy knew would affect him significantly.
Yeah, this is what I'm interested in. There must have been more to it than what we were shown.
Since most members of Millis stayed loyal to one person their entire life, Alina Lise just suddenly leaving could very well shake the foundations of his entire faith. There was no telling what a blow like that would do to him, especially for someone as devout as him. Alina Lise was so firm in the way she spoke, though, that Rudy knew he wouldn't be able to convince her otherwise. It also didn't help that she thought part of this was her fault either. Since she was the one who told Rudy to stay here initially, she couldn't help but feel that some of this mess was her responsibility. Switching over to Zanaba now, his whole conversation just confirmed that he was a real one. There's nothing to add other than that, so that brings us now to Rudy's turning point.
I did like his thing. It's like, look, if you want me to come with you, I will, but there's no real point in me going, and I need to look after blah, 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 but, you know, if you want me to, I will. Like, you know, you're still my master, I still respect you, do anything for you.
The night before, he'd spent contemplating whether he should go or not, and for every reason he found making it seem like he should go, he just found another convincing him not to. It was a constant tug-of-war between betrayal and responsibility. It was Norn's act the day after that helped him to finally make up his mind, since it made him realize exactly the type of luxury he was dealing with. You see, unlike Norn, who didn't get to weigh her options of staying versus going, Rudy actually could. Though he didn't realize it at the time, just having the option to choose was a luxury that no one else could afford right now. I mean, it's not like Norn could just get up and travel to the Begarit continent, because it wasn't something she knew how to do. Rudy, on the other hand, could make the journey, save his parents, and come back safely, yet here he was choosing not to. It was something that Norn didn't even have to fall to make him realize. All she had to do was ask why, with all his power and experience, he wasn't doing anything, and that was enough to make him understand. There were people who could take care of Sylphie while he was gone, but he was the only one who could save his parents. It's the reason why Geese wrote the letter to him and no one else. This would lead to Rudy's life-changing decision, and it marks the end of what was his once peaceful home and school life. So, that's Turning Point 3 as it was in the novels, and as I'm sure you could tell, they did quite a good job bringing it to life. I'm sure some of you were expecting something as crazy as Turning Points 1 and 2.
I really was. I really was. I was so worried. I was like, but I am more worried about the journey now. It's like,
But not all turning points have to be super dramatic. There's simply points in the story where a decisive change is made, which in this case is Rudy leaving Sylphie and going to Begarit. But yeah, that's pretty much all I gotta say for this, so I hope you enjoyed this video on MUSHOKU Tensei, and if you did, consider leaving a like and subscribing. Feel free to check out the New Beginnings collection too, because it'll only be around until the end of the season. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao.
Bam. Awesome, awesome, awesome. I love it when I always say this, I love it when Annie News does a cut content video series on something that I watch. It just adds to it. Tower of God! Please. When Tower of God comes back, I need it. That was boss. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And we'll see what happens next time. Thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video and want to be able to watch Patreon-only reactions, such as the original Dragon Ball series, links in the description to the Patreon page. $1 a month is all I ask to help support the channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thanks for that. Thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? You guys think of this? Click like, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave comments below. Let me know what I should watch and discuss in future videos. I'll see you guys, next time.